students, today we will study about the development of the interatrial septum. The interatrial septum develops at the end of the fourth week of the intrauterine life. In this picture, you can see there is a looping of the heart tube. As you all know, the heart develops from a single tube. After further development, it shows looping of that tube which gives the U-shaped structure. To see the development of the interatrial septum, we should take a section of this looping heart. In this looping heart, you can see the four part, that is the outflow part, which is called as the truncus or ysources. This is the primitive ventricle. This is the primitive atrium, which is also called as a common atrium, and this part is a part of the sinus venosus, which is also called as a inflow part. In this common atrium, the interatrial septum develops from the roof of this common atrium. It develops from the two sources, that is, first source is the septum primum and second one is the septum secundum. After fusion of these two septa, the common atrium divides into the right atrium and the left atrium. So let's see the stages in formation of the interatrial septum. In this picture, you can see the interior of the developing heart. This is the common atrium, which is also called as a primitive atrium. This is the common ventricle. Also, we can call it as a primitive ventricle. This is the cushion between the atrium and the ventricle, which is called as a atrioventricular cushion, or it is also called as a endocardium cushion. So, at the end of the fourth week, a sickle-shaped crest or the septa grows from the roof of the primitive atrium and it grows downwards towards the AV cushion. This septa develops first, that's why it is called as a septum primum. There is a space before the fusion of the septum primum and the AV cushion. There is a space between the septum primum and the AV cushion. This space forms the foramen, which is called as a foramen primum. This foramen primum is also called as a ostium primum. As this foramen primum closes or it fuses with the AV cushion, the upper part of the septum primum breaks down due to the cell death, or it forms the perforation. And this perforation forms a second foramina. That's why it is called as a foramen secundum, or it is also labeled as a ostium secundum because this is the second foramina. Simultaneously, a rigid or the more tough septa grows from the right side of the septum primum, and this is the second septa which grows. That's why this septum is also called as a septum secundum. When the septum secundum grows downward, there is a oblique valvular passage between the superior margin of the septum primum and inferior margin of the septum secundum, and this valvular passage is called as a foramen ovale. This foramen ovale acts like a one-way wall. It allows the blood flow from the right atrium to the left atrium. The functional closure of the foramen ovale occurs immediately after the birth. This functional closure is also called as a physiological closure, while the anatomical closure of foramen ovale occurs at the 6 to 8 month after the birth. So let's see how the foramen ovale act or the mechanism of foramen ovale before birth. In this picture, you can see before birth there is a high pressure in the right atrium. So this is the septum primum, act like a wall, and this is the foramen ovale. This is the inferior margin of the septum secundum, and this is the superior margin of the septum primum. Before birth, as the pressure increases in the right atrium, the septum primum moves towards the left side, and through the foramen ovale, blood flows from the right atrium to the left atrium. While after the birth, there is a physiological closure of the foramen ovale. Again, you can compare the previous picture and this picture. Again, a septum primum, septum secundum, a right atrium and the left atrium. After birth, a left atrium receives blood from the lungs. So, here the pressure increases. As the pressure increases, the septum primum pushes towards the right side and it comes in contact with the inferior margin of the septum secundum, and this closes the foramen ovale, and this is called as a functional closure or the physiological closure of the foramen ovale. After complete development of the interatrial septum, it shows remnant in the right atrium. In adults, it shows the fossa ovalis. So let's see what is fossa ovalis. The fossa ovalis is a small depression which is present in the right atrium, and it is formed by the septum primum. At the upper margin of the fossa ovalis, it shows the prominent structure which is called as a limbus fossa, or it is also called as a annulus fossa ovalis. This annulus fossa ovalis represent the septum secundum. Again, I can say, as you know, septum primum and the septum secundum forms the interatrial septum. This remnant or this marking shows at the interatrial septum in the right atrium. So let's see the congenital anomalies during the development of the interatrial. The atrial septal defect, ASD. The atrial septal defect means there is a defect in the formation of the atrial septum. As you know, the foramen ovale is a valvular oblique passage between the septum secundum and the septum primum. When there is a incomplete anatomical fusion between the septum primum and the septum secundum, the foramen ovale remain patent, and this is called as a patent foramen oval, or it is also known as a propatency of foramen oval, because the probe is used to check the patency of the foramen oval. That's why it is also called as a propatency of foramen oval. Ostium primum defect is also called as a foramen primum defect. As you know, the ostium primum is a space between the septum primum and the AV cushion. So when the septum primum does not fuse with the AV cushion, or sometimes there is a defective formation of the AV cushion, the ostium primum defect occurs. Ostium secundum defect is also called as a foramen secundum defect. You can see in this picture, when there is an excessive reabsorption of the septum primum and the septum secundum, or both septum, there is a large opening between the right and the left atrium. So this causes the ostium secundum. Septum secundum defect, you can compare this with the foramen secundum defect. In this picture, you can see there is a absence of the septum secundum. When the septum secundum fails to develop, it also shows the large opening between the two atria, and this forms the septum secundum. Next is a common atrium. Common atrium, the name suggesting there is a no division or the no septum between the atrium. In this picture, you can see this is the common atrium and there is an absence of the interatrial septa. So yes, as you know, as we have seen, the interatrial septum forms by the two sources, that is septum primum and the septum secundum. When this both septum primum and the septum secundum is failed to develop, it forms the common atrium. It is also called as a triloculare biventriculare.